Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone today to our forum. It is June the 25th. It's a few minutes after 4 o'clock Central Standard Time, and I want to thank you all for making the time to participate in this conversation. And good afternoon. It's a warm, sunny afternoon in Texas. And we've scheduled this conversation for 1 hour, but we have some additional time for Q&A if it needs to be extended. And we will end at 5:30. So if you need to jump off before then, please know that we will be recording the conversation and we may make it available with the permission of our panelists today. I want to thank, before we end this series, I want to thank the planning team who's been a part of helping orchestrate and put it all together, and that includes Tam, Creighton, Bruce, Terry, Andrew, and Mary Beth. And they put in a lot of extra time and extra energy and extra hours to make this happen. So thank you all for your commitment and your willingness to just step up and help get us to this point. And this is, the end of a forum, but not the end of the work, not the end of the conversation, not the end of our efforts in making sure that we make our organization as best it can be. And that means making sure that it is equitable and diverse and inclusive and strong and resilient and bold like Texas. So I want to remind everybody about our PEE forum coming up on July 2nd. It will be back here, same time, same place, Zoom, 4 p.m. And that's next Thursday. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to Tam to get this conversation started. And I hope everyone has a great weekend and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thanks, Laura. First off, let me let you guys know how privileged and honored I am to be here. Just a part of Lyceum. I was had the privilege of looking at the last two panels and listening to them. And I was so proud to be a Lyceumite based off of the vulnerability and the just raw desire to share what people's experiences were and how they wanted to make Texas better. I'm always proud of us. I just want that to be very clear. But when you're dealing with a topic that's such a hot button as race, and there have been many groups that have failed to confront that issue. And I'm just proud of the leadership team and Laura Dixon in particular, and how she's just steadfastly pivoted in a really difficult time to be a president of any organization. And so for COVID-19 and then what's going on currently with social unrest. And also, I think it's something to be said of this panel today being an all-female Black panel talking about policy and the business of things. And the male panel talked about their feelings and emotions. So I think that was a good switch up. That being said, I'd like to introduce my esteemed colleagues. You all know Sarah Jackson. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Well, that is so sweet of you. Thank you, Tam. Hello, I'm Sarah Jackson. I hail from Dallas, Texas. I am the Vice President of Strategy and Public Affairs for the Dallas Citizens Council, which is an organization of CEOs and prominent executives in the Dallas area who work on policy issues that move the city forward at strategic points in time, and also work on big strategic infrastructure investments. Outside of that, I'm quite active in Civic Dallas and around the state and nation. That's me.
Thank you, Sarah. And the lovely Mayor Pro Tem, Andrea Bearfield, would you please introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Tam. It is my honor and pleasure to serve on this panel with you, esteemed ladies. As Tam mentioned, I am currently serving as Mayor Pro Tem for the City of Waco, representing District 1. And that's my volunteer gig. And I'm actually employed as the Executive Director of Texas Brazos Trail Region, which is part of the Texas Heritage Trails Program, which focuses on heritage and cultural tourism throughout Texas. I currently represent 18 counties within my region. and am checking boxes on myriad boards and organizations, and am always happy to say I'm a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated.
Just had to throw that in there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you gotta get it in.
So ladies, let's get started. First off, let's level set. I think there's a lot that's been going on. Everyone wants to talk about it. You see Twitter feeds with I stand with Black Americans and everything. So can policy dismantle the social ill of racism? Is it even possible? And then also I want to, before you answer, want to let the audience know that this conversation is intended to be like a table talk. So it's like friends and colleagues just talking amongst themselves with people viewing it. So do you think racism can be or dismantled by legislation or policy? Anybody? Sarah?
Well, I would first defer to my esteemed colleague who actually is a representative for a municipal area first, and then I'll come in with my illustrious ideas.
So I would definitely say that it can address it. I think it's going to take far more than just policy to be able to dismantle anything. It would take literally, and I say this as a Wacoan with full pun, just breaking down all the silos that we live in. Because it can't just be, if I set policy on this hand, that means that, you know, all of the things that make our community move have to be willing to take that same effort. And right now we are not. Will we be? We pray. But we can set initiatives, and we can do our part as a municipality to set practicums in place and policy in place and make demands on the other aspects of the things that make this world turn to push the needle. Dismantle by policy alone? No.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you, Andrea. You know, for me, when I saw that question, I was just kind of like, you know, racism to me, if you understand going back, it's a social construct, right? Literally, it was created, I think the 1500s is the first time we ever saw the word race in print. And so there, from that, you can kind of see how society over time has given it meaning and life, you know, given it like that's good, that's bad, all this other stuff. And so for me, race and policy, there is a close connection, which is why I've always been fascinated. When you think back to blockbusting and redlining and a lot of what would be the drivers of affirmative action in education at some point, it was all this idea that somehow people's personal biases were prohibiting equitable systems, right? So it's all about the system. And so, you know, when you think of it that way, it's like, can policy somehow eradicate or legislate racism? It's like, can you really, like, you know, use policy or legislation to change people's minds and thoughts and feelings? And the short answer to that is no. I mean, if that was the case, I think there are a lot of isms in our society that are very, prejudice and frankly discriminatory that would no longer exist if that was the case, right? We could just, you know, sign a bill and pass a bill and it'd be gone, and that's not the case. So I think, you know, what we can do, to your point, Andrea, is that we could find ways where, you know, the progress of policy has been inhibited by racism at some point in the policymaking process, and trying to, you know, make it more equitable. So in the case of housing, some of these ways of sort of using policy and business development to create more equitable housing around neighborhoods. So instead of having concentrated areas of poverty, you find ways to sort of break it so that you have greater diversity in neighborhoods, education systems and classes, and, you know, to where you also, frankly, like in a place like Dallas, you over time no longer have food deserts in one of the largest cities in the country.
So I believe that policy absolutely has a strong role in it, and here's why. So racism was, I'm sorry?
I said created by policy.
It was created by policy. Yes, that's where I'm going with this. It was literally created, and then we have this notion that it somehow was created centuries ago by policy. I think we divorce ourselves from bad policy always has bad outcomes and sometimes cost lives. And we're seeing that in COVID-19, right? We're seeing that, you know, a perpetuation of sometimes maybe even well-intentioned policy had negative outcomes that perpetuated these systems that Sarah spoke of. So I think, you know, you utilize policy to help you get there with the changing of hearts and minds. And I think groups like this one is vital to help change minds so we can have conversation, we can have discourse and do what we were designed to do. So thank you, ladies, for that. Right now, speaking of policy, there's been a lot of talk nationwide about defunding police forces and what that means. I personally believe it's a fancy term for reimagining what public safety looks like and innovating. I think it's a failed marketing campaign. That never in a million years would I have used the word defund, because that's scary to people. And I think about the work that Angela Davis has been doing over the last 50 years over the prison industrial complex and how you have all these systems that are on top of each other. So right now, for the first time, I believe in our nation's history, that we have 3 sitting Black senators. I personally am proud of the fact that we have senators on both party sides. I'm also saddened by the fact. Me too. I'm also put it out there. You gotta plug in when you can, Sarah. I'm also saddened by the fact that we only have 3 Black senators sitting at one time in 2020. Like this shouldn't be, you know, I think it was, what was it, 2018 when there was 2, and that was the first time in our nation's history. And so right now, these senators, which I find interesting, is the Black senators that have these Policing and Policy Act, sponsored by Senators Harris and Booker, and then the Justice Acts, which are sponsored by Senator Scott. Do you think we should be having this kind of discussion, or what's the best case scenario for this, or either one of these policies you think to culminate in a result that makes us actually safe, and all of us safer? Let me be clear, because I had to explain to one of my dear white friends and colleagues that, you know, she's like, well, why did he run? Well, we don't see the police the same way you do. And so that is why he probably ran. And so safer for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I actually, no, go ahead, Andre. You look like you're about to. Well, I was going to say, you know, Tam, I you know, checked out both those bills because, you know, I don't play a lot in the work I do daily on the federal level. And what struck me is that they both were very similar. And so, like, you know, in thinking about what we want, like what would be a good outcome as citizens of this nation, to me, it would be a blend of both. I think you know, with policy, you know, and this is the thing with the policymaking process, it always breaks down in the implementation. And so as I was reading sort of the facets of each of those bills, I'm like, how is, you know, how is, you know, police department X and city Y going to manage whatever comes down in that bill? And that was kind of the lens in which I looked at it. One of the things I think was common across both of those bills is that, you know, they're like, let's, you know, have lynching, you know, banned. Well, again, this is something where in 2020, it's so sad and realistic that we're, you know, what is it we want to pass in this police justice bill is that lynching, yes, please, like lynching should no longer be legal. Like, why are we still talking about
you should have an expectation that police shouldn't kill people in their custody. I mean, just low hanging.
Maybe, no, there's that too. There's that too, but then there's some other stuff in there. Like if you look at, you know, Senator Scott's bill related to transparency, you know, trying to ensure that the system. So these all goes back to systems. And so, like, I think of late with everything going on, folks have been talking about systematic racism. And I think that's something, you know, it's not for us to get into in the weeds right now, but I would argue a lot of people don't understand what that means. And so, because they don't necessarily see all institutions as interconnected, nor do they understand how systems truly work. And so when you think about it that way, you think about the system of, you know, public safety and all the entities that are within that system, when you start to see that, like, one of the pieces that Senator Scott proposed was having, I believe, you know, frankly, officers who had some sort of infraction, like having them reported into the FBI, like, Okay, yes, right? Like these are all trying to find ways to get our systems to work better together. And, you know, it's always been, and this is a, you know, whether it's human trafficking or if they're talking about issues of just basic crime, you think about, not to go off, but like Ted Bundy. I mean, the way that guy got away with stuff for so long is because he was crossing state lines and states weren't talking. So you have to, this is a problem we've had connecting systems even within our nation, and then now having systems connected nationally. I think, you know, for this, both these bills, I think what will probably happen is the blending of the two, hopefully getting the best part so that we can, you know, move forward as a nation.
So one of the things that, and I do agree with you because they're incredibly similar, and words matter. Words matter in how we interpret and how we push. And sometimes I think some of them are written because perhaps we know our audience and we use words that they're more comfortable with. However, some of the things that we need to make sure we walk away with or from is the lack of accountability in the roles of policing. And as we mentioned, you know, reporting if you have infractions on your record, if you've, you know, been abusive, use of force, all of that needs to be dictated. It's the same thing that rolls within the education industry, is that you can't just go from school to school to school as a bad apple. If you did this, it has to be dictated and noted. And one of the things that has happened and you know, how we adjust and shift due to our climate is somewhere in the 90s to the 2000s, we switched from community policing to militarized policing. And it was because, you know, of the acts of terrorism that we were falling upon as a country. And while it's not our fault, it is our problem because we lost our pathway to build relationships with the communities and policing. And so, you know, you've lost an avenue of, as Tam mentioned, you know, if I have a relationship or my understanding and relationship with policing as opposed to my Anglo counterparts or anybody's relationship with policing shifted when, you know, we took a militarized stance on what that looks like. I mean, in Waco, Texas, in one of our parks, at one time there was a tank sitting in the middle of it.
What?
Okay.
Oh my God.
But I mean, and it was a high crime area, but why in the world, you know, would Waco need a tank to fight crime? Okay.
This is after the Brent Davidian, I assume, Andrew?
Oh no, this was a few years ago.
Okay.
I'm not talking about past.
Concept.
I'm talking about.
So, wow.
So what we're doing is using, and that happens from federal level. They sell or pass down all of these military equipment that we've used in war. But I'm not understanding where that's okay. But the disconnect of how knowing your neighbors or getting to know your beat, getting out of your car, walking and engaging with the people who live and work in your community has become such a distant thought. So, you know, there have to be aspects of that as priority, you know, making sure you're accountable, making sure, you know, choking folks to death is not okay. Making sure that we rebuild and reestablish what community policing looks like, you know, making sure that, you know, people are encouraged to join law enforcement. I am proud to say my nephew is a police officer, you know, and served in the military police as well as right now as a current cop. And I love him and I'm so proud of him. And he has always wanted to be a cop, but there need to be 50, hundreds, thousands more like him, because that's the only way we're going to change the way I, as a Black woman, feel when I know, you know, on that rare occasion, if the lights come on behind my car, that I'm not freaking out because I don't know how it's going to end up. And am I going to make it from this routine traffic stop? That has to change. That has to change on all levels. And, you know, and I think that we as municipalities run, you know, get into a pattern of angst, if you will, because, you know, however this bill goes depends on what kind of federal money I get to keep doing my policing. So I think that's what all needs to be addressed. And I think that I would hope see, we're cautious optimists. I would hope
I know.
that on either side we could get to some logical
Me too.
deal making.
Yeah. Fingers crossed on it. Like, I don't know about that one.
I know. Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh no, I was just sharing my optimism so that folks will come together. They don't have to get in front of the steps of the Capitol and sing, but that at least they'll do something to hopefully get some momentum going on this.
So
yeah, I mean, and I need the anti-lynching. I mean, the anti-lynching's on both sides, because again, that's just stupid.
Why are we so? Why are we
just stupid? What's allowed to remain. So I want to kind of shift a little bit, because I thought that we would talk about, you know, the issue that's brought a lot of the protesting and current unrest. So we had to talk about, you know, criminal justice reformation. But Sarah, you said it so succinctly earlier that all these systems aren't disconnected. And so although we're focusing on criminal justice reformation, all of these systems are tied together. And so, and, you know, and I have to make a point that I do believe that having a diverse police force is helpful. I still believe also that that's not just it, right? It's a system and a culture that has shifted, as you both so thoughtfully pointed out, with the militarization of our police forces across the United States. But let's shift into the economic parity piece. We just recently saw with COVID-19 the huge health disparities. We've seen Black businesses and brown businesses and brown people in their health as well suffer at disproportionate rates. We've had the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which was designed to make it discriminatory to set wages based off gender. Like if you paid one for the other, you had to pay for the other. I don't know if that was a success, you know, because we're looking at it now, and women still are paid so much less than men. And when you go into women of color, that it drops down even more.
Yeah.
What would be, like, how can we proceed? Is it legislation? Is it transparency and pay scale, which is legislated? Like, how do we get and shift to where, you know, and I'm going to say this, which is not popular, I have to remember that I'm being recorded. But can we talk about why might there be an element of some criminal activity? Like, what would cause someone to want to live a different path or find different means of income? And I think we have to talk about that too. And I'm not saying that that's right. I'm just saying that that's a reality. If you don't have the same economic opportunities as others, you might go a different path to fill in that gap. So I know I went way around the mulberry bush.
Yeah, so there's a line. There's a line. And if anyone, I told this to a girlfriend the other day, in that Hulu series called Little Fires Everywhere, with Reese Witherspoon and Kerry Washington. And, you know, since we're having a little gal talk, you know, obviously with an audience of people, but there was a line in the movie where, if you see, or in the series, if you've seen it, where Kerry Washington says to Reese Witherspoon's character, who's very affluent, she says, well, you know, so essentially Reese Witherspoon's character is judging Kerry Washington's character for making some poor decisions throughout her life. And Kerry Washington says back to Reese Witherspoon, you know, you've had options. Your entire life, you've had options. And so you don't know what it is to have no options or limited options. And so don't judge me. Don't look at me from that lens. And so to your question, Tam, you know, I think in your question, kind of this discussion of, you know, pay, where we are, the fact we're still talking about this, you know, obviously, you know, 50 years later, you know, the thing with public policy in general, I think, is you have to look at it in the time that it was created, right? So if you've ever seen that movie, if you can't tell, I love pop culture, on the basis of sex, right? Which talks about the passage of this. You know, you see that in getting it to where it is, you know, it got done, right? It was monumental for the time. And so I guess the question is, in its current form, does it still serve the time? And I think that's a different question. I think that's a different discussion, because I think now what you see is that, like in education, I mean, one of the reasons why you don't have equitable, a lot of the pay equity is that a lot of women of color aren't going into STEM fields, right? The higher paying fields. And then when you look at corporate jobs, you see a lot of folks of color, the intersectionality of both gender and race. They're not in the senior leadership teams of a lot of these larger 40, 50s or 100s, although there's been progress, right? And so it's one of those things where I think, how could you legislate an improvement? I think that, you know, it's a discussion, because frankly, with private enterprises, they are private enterprises, right? Like, so it's hard for the government to go tell AT&T, this is what you have to do. But I think what you're seeing now is a lot of the larger companies are feeling the societal shifts, which is what gets companies to really move, because they're consumer based, right, or the larger folks. And so you're seeing more diversity of boards, public boards, private boards, knowing from whether it be age or gender or race, understanding how diversity around the table can make for better decision making for private enterprises, frankly, more money. What do you ladies think?
So a couple of years ago, several people around the city participated in the Race Equity Institute training. It's Race Equity Institute out of North Carolina. And one of the things that struck most of the non-persons of color is the discussion of the Monopoly game. So if you, let's say we start a Monopoly game, and all of the people of color are allowed to begin the game. You know, you're buying up your stuff, buying your hotels, you know, passing to, you know, collecting your 200 and all of that. So if I don't allow Anglos to play until 4 hours later, is it possible for them to win? Well, when you look at pay gap is in relation to gender, if you're adding Black women in that, let's say 6 hours, you know, that you can't play. And the gap is monumental. I mean, I think in Texas, the median wage for Black women is $37,969 to a white man $65,965, and that's right now. That's 2020. And
Yeah.
so, you know, what can you set legislation to change that? Not directly. However, I know for me, I can determine how I incentivize. So with companies and corporations coming in, you know, I can say that this, you know, living wage has to be, you know, at the forefront. I can't allow you, I won't incentivize. Why would I incentivize you to not pay my constituency, not pay, to give the people an opportunity to have a living wage? You know, that's foolish on my part. And I have explained that numerous times to our chambers of commerce. And I want them to make sure that when they go out, you know, and they're asking about diversity of boards, and they're asking about leadership and equity in leadership. And those are the things that if you keep asking the question, people will have to answer you. And especially if they need something from you. Absolutely. See, that's where we're going to go into this give and take, because this is not just, oh, you're doing me a favor. No, you need something from me. And so let's get to agreeable terms. And I think that, you know, we have responsibility, especially as electeds of color, have a responsibility to see that those things become a priority in our conversation, and we don't move off of it until they do.
But Andrea, I really love what you said about electeds of color. But I also want for others to know that it's not your sole responsibility.
Oh, no.
And I know you know that, but I get protected of my Black elected officials. And I often
appreciate you.
Well, you know, yes. And so, and I remind other constituents, this actually happened to me. I'm trying not to name names, but I was meeting with all of my council, just so it's not transactional, right? Mm-hmm. And when we turned into a 10-1 district, I was asked, well, why do you want to meet with me? I'm not in your district. It's not a Black district. And first of all, it's Austin. No district is a Black district. Right. Second of all, why wouldn't I want to meet? We're supposed to be working together for the good of the city, even though we're in districts. So, and I had to explain that. And she was like, oh, well, you know, it's like, okay. But that being said, I think you guys are right. I think if the civil rights movement, and part of the other part of Dr. King's dream was economic parity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a dream that didn't get, unfortunately, taken off because of his assassination. But,
yeah, and Tam, I just want to say one quick thing, because Andrea mentioned it, and you know, it wouldn't be Lyceum if I didn't point it out. Like, I liked a lot of what you said, but the one thing I think about is we think about like living wage, the concept of the living wage. Right? That's something that probably some of the folks on this call that, you know, they may have heard of but don't really understand. And essentially that's saying that there should be a bar. Some cities, I think, work on sort of a higher minimum wage, right, where you get to 10 or 11 dollars, and that's where you should get into partisanship, which is where you get a little complicated. I mean, we don't want to think about it that way because we see ourselves as all, you know, caring about our, you know, to some extent our neighbor. But when you start to get into dollars and cents, it gets a bit partisan. And I think, you know, as we think about a possible solution, that's one issue. The living wage has come up. But I would say, at least in our area, in Dallas County, it's only come up from Democratic politicians. Like, I haven't heard a Republican politician talking about a living wage, not to say they don't, but that's one of those things where then you have to marry the politics with what should we be doing as a society. And so I bring this up because to me, that's somewhat of a conundrum in this debate of how do you legislate with pay parity, right?
Which is true. And that's the sad part about this, because regardless of which box you check as you're voting, I dare you to live on $8 an hour. I don't know that that's possible.
Well said.
I mean, she's right. No, you're right. You're right.
Right. But where I was moving with that is that to couple some of what both of you said was that what we've seen work when it has worked well was we've seen policy, federal policy come in and try to dismantle some racist systemic system. And then we've seen the implementation down on the local level, but that's been paired with, back to Andrea's point, with some kind of pressure, if you will, from citizens and that responsibility to ask, hey, what does your board makeup look like? Hey, what is, you know, what I've been touting recently, but most of my career in the chamber work, what does your supplier diversity vendor list look like? Like, who are you spending your money with? You know, and during this recent round of protests, I was literally asked the question, well, how can we help Black business? And I said, well, you can help Black business. It's the same thing I've been saying for the last 10 years. You can help them with your dollars. And then I was asked, well, other than money, how else can you help them? And I was like, it's a business. Like, I don't know. How do you help a business without giving it money? It's there to generate revenue. If it doesn't generate revenue, it dies. So, you know, it's just some interesting things. I think we might have time for one more question, then we'll switch. But is there anything else you ladies would like for people to know? Or I want to get into a little bit, if you allow me to, get into a little bit about affirmative action. And the reason why I want to bring it up. No?
No, I'm joking. I was just joking. I'd never heard of it. I don't know what it is.
I know. And so I, you know, grew up in I think it was the first generation of like multicultural America. And and that had its challenges, of course, because people became more protective of their cultures when you're trying to tell them to blend and mix, right? And so, and I think sometimes it promoted racism even more. And I remember distinctly being 5 years old and our white suburban skating rink, and the first time I was called a nigger. And I didn't know what a nigger was. I was like, what the heck, you know? And I just knew this little boy meant it. The way he said it was not what my parents or God had said about me, which is what I teach my children even now, that, you know, whatever God says about you or I say about you is your truth. Anything else is noise. And so that being said, I've been challenged throughout my academic career, throughout my professional career, to justify my being a lot of times, as though I'm an affirmative action hire, or I got to school on affirmative action, as though I had no merit on my own. And so currently, California has a proposition on tap, Prop 209, and it is calling for the repealing of affirmative action bans in public spaces, mainly education, the police force, and things of that nature. So I was wondering if you guys, first of all, can you identify with any of that? Does any of that start off story about being accused of being an affirmative action hire or person resonate? And actually, as I say this out loud, it actually happened also in Texas Lyceum. A candidate came up and basically said to me and to some other minority candidates that we'd get in, or I got in because I was an affirmative, because I was Black, and that they would have a good chance because they were something other than white. And I was so angry. And so and even in Lyceum, that there is that juxtaposition. So does that resonate with you? What do you think about affirmative action and policy?
Oh, I was looking to our senior representative from Waco, our senior lady. But yeah, you know, affirmative action, you know, for especially like for someone who is on the right of center is a difficult one, right? Because, you know, in a lot of ways, it's the continued presence of affirmative action means we as a nation haven't come as far as we think we have. And so it's mere presence sort of is a questioning of progress. But in a lot of places, you know, it has been, you know, integral in allowing for more diversity in spaces. I think in some of the Ivy League, you know, the problem you have, and even some of the higher education systems is, you know, frankly, within like Black America, there was a thing where, you know, when a lot of affirmative action implementation or you know, policy was put down, what happened were more like Africans were coming into Black American spots. And so then you had this tension between Black Americans and Africans. And as someone who has parents who immigrated from Sierra Leone, like it's something that, you know, I'm aware of sometimes where, you know, the organization I work for now, I was the first person of any color to work for the Dallas Citizens Council when I started in 2014, and the organization had been around since 1937. And so unfortunately, a lot of my job, even though my job was clearly public affairs, but a lot of it focused on me having to, you know, sort of really start to build bridges in the Black and white community, specifically the Black community, that had this real distrust of the organization, because we're the organization that frankly desegregated schools in the 60s, but in a way that many people didn't feel honored the culture of Black Dallasites. And so there still is a lot of history there. And so to the question, Tam, you know, I think affirmative action to some extent is still needed in certain institutions. To some extent, I think we want to believe that our biases don't affect our ability to make objective decisions, but unfortunately we've seen that to not be true. And so I think, you know, in certain places it's still needed, maybe in others it's not, because the, you know, board or governing structure is diverse enough to where you have a pool of applicants that are diverse, or you have a governing body that's diverse, that really has varied experiences to allow folks from, you know, certain geographical places, different ages, different races, to be a part of an organization. And so you don't, it's not maybe as needed, but I think in some places it might still be needed. What do you think, Andrea?
So the fact that all three of us probably stand in position that we were the first of something at our age is ridiculous, and evident that, you know, we have not yet overcome. And I think that where we would suffer, you know, with repealing, you know, and that repealing affirmative action could kind of be like defunding the police, in phrasing, in words. And, you know, but what my fear would be is that I have set a standard that, you know, is subjective to whomever is in control. And, you know, for instance, I know that if I don't set a precedent for the number of MBE contractors, you know, or specific, then it may not happen. Will not happen. If we don't set that precedent and set that tone, you know, there are things that will continue to be ignored and continue to be looked over. And that is problematic because we cannot go in another step further. Now, in admitting I don't, I need to really look in and do more of a deep dive as to what's, Sacramento, right, is looking at doing, but I don't know how in the United States of Texas that's going to work out right now. I think I still, and I believe we all know that while, our professional climb, our skill sets, our abilities are unprecedented, and we are absolutely, deserving to be in the rooms that we walk in and sit at the tables that we sit at. Everyone doesn't, feel that way, and sometimes it is necessary to speak to some of those disparities that we have, and and the sad thing is that we do, and are proving ourselves daily in this work and in what we do. But I mean, until I believe that equality has happened and equity has happened, we can't give up on that fight until we have to use all the tools that we have in the toolbox to do so.
It has been my absolute pleasure talking with you ladies today. I always am giddy when I get to talk to both of you. I want to end on this note with a quote. You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do that work all the time. And that was Angela Davis. Yeah, and so that's hopeful for me. That being said, Lyceumites, I want to thank all of you guys for being on the call again. We're probably going to switch to Q&A, but what we wanted you to know is that we're grateful to have these discussions. We solicit your feedback. We want to know, what did you think of this? Not just for this panel, but for all of it. Is this something that we should continue doing? And how, as Lyceumites, can we continue to shape policy in a way that makes Texas better? I want to thank the panels before us, our experience panel. I also want to thank the allyship panel. And I also want to remind you guys on July 2nd, again, the candidate forum, and then also the get to know the class of 2020. Those are coming up. So where you can, please join in, because although we're apart, we're still together. And I see a couple of questions in the chat. Bear with me, because I'm technically not great, to say the least. I think Dr. Lopez had a couple of questions that were great, and I tried to answer one, and then I think I accidentally dismissed the other one. And so, I can see the one that's still here. It says, the first one was, and if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And then those of you, I'm waiting on Mary Beth to kind of give us direction and tell us what we're doing. But the first question on tap is, what about increasing the quality and length of training of police officers? If the system and institution of policing was established under a system of racism, aren't police officers of color still affected or influenced by the institutionalized racism?
Oh, absolutely. If you go back historically, and policing as we know it came from the patty rollers and capturing enslaved. So from Waco's perspective, with African American officers, we only have 8%. And, it is incredibly difficult to be Black in a system, especially now, where, if you're called, honorably to do, which the majority of our police force is, to protect and serve, but there are situations when I know that implicit bias is ruling, and some of the decisions that we do, some of the choices that are made by our fellow officers are an affront to my person. And it's incredibly hard to go to work every day and stand up and protect and serve along with these people who mean you no good. intentionally or with implicit bias. Is more training necessary? Absolutely. I know that many of the police departments are doing implicit bias, but the problem is I don't think anybody's going back and evaluating what happens after that training is given.
There's no accountability.
There's no accountability. And so that's one of the things that I told my chief of police. I was like, okay, so that's great that y'all had the training. Did everybody get it? Were you? Yeah. There should be a quiz later, because if you didn't get it, it's not going to help us anyway.
Did everybody get it? Yeah. And what do your numbers? Do they reflect your MSA and your arrest rates and your stop rates? Are we capturing that information? Yeah, so sorry.
Yeah, and to that point, the only thing I was going to add, and I know everybody heard about this, what happened last summer in Dallas for the trial, Amber Geiger and Botham Jean here in Dallas, where she had been trained, 6 months before she shot that man in his apartment. She had been trained about de-escalation, and I think implicit bias training as well, but yet the incident still happened. And granted, the incident had some different circumstances, but yeah, I think people like to fall back to training sometimes because it's something. Like saying it's tangible, we can say we did something. But if you're not measuring impacts on the back end, then you're really just running around, right? And so, Tam, if you don't mind, I was going to just speak out the second question that Dr. Lopez had. Is that cool?
Yeah, I was going to.
Yeah. So, okay, no, so I wanted to answer.
You want to moderate, Sarah? You want to moderate?
No, please no. I just saw it. I was thinking, oh, it's shiny.
Okay, here, go ahead. There it is. It's in the chat. Okay.
He just talked about diverting some dollars from Dr. Lopez in San Antonio. How about diverting some dollars used for policing to affecting the root cause of why we need to do so much over-policing? So mental health, pre-K, social work, job opportunities. And Tam, I'm not going to hijack your answer, but the only thing I wanted to add to it is that, I think this goes back to, kind of thinking about our systems and where do we want to invest money or time or resources. And I think, what we're finding is that, especially in the realm of public education, like public education is I've heard it described as the great equalizer in our nation. Like if students do not have a good foundation, we should not be surprised that they end up in prison, 10 years later, right? And I'm not to say that's where everybody ends up who doesn't get a good education. I think you see people like Bill Gates.
There are 70% of prisoners are illiterate, 70%. So
yeah, but that's a whole nother conversation, because I was like, but we didn't start at the same place of education.
Yeah, so. And that's what I'm talking about. I think we're all talking about that. Like that's the result of poor education for them.
Right. So to that question, Esteban, I think it's spot on. I think in a lot of communities of color, there's great now consideration for mental health and investment there. As well as social work and other needs, which is where you get, the current kind of movement to maybe reallocate the dollars from police funding to the areas where because police officers aren't counselors. And so if a lot of their job is spent counseling, then they're not policing. And so these things are all interconnected. I think it's a very astute observation, and I think it's something that, frankly, at many levels, so Andrea and her board, Waco, in Dallas and Dallas County, people just gotta have to look at the whole ecosystem and say, you know what, this system really isn't working for us. How do we reallocate resources to make it more effective?
And money's not manna from heaven, and we have to find other ways to get it. Right now in Waco, our foundations have really stood up and worked with our police as well as the schools of social work that are here in mounting the behavior specialist task force. And so what they're trying to do is fuse funds into policing with social workers, with, even building facilities that will kind of serve as a stop point. So if I make a stop and someone's having a mental episode, then I can, take them immediately to this behavioral health clinic and let them do what they do as opposed and let me go back to policing, because I may not be a trained therapist, and that's not what I need to spend 2 hours whereas I could have taken them to this facility and going on to my next call. So we have to figure out the multiple avenues to do this, but it can and should be done.
Yeah, agreed.
So we have another question. It is, what role can policy play to promote entrepreneurship to allow more people the opportunity to build a business and grow jobs? I've got a lot of answers to that, but I'm going to let you.
I was like, let Tam close that one because I know
I
she's
know,
writing books right now.
Why don't you start and we can fill in, you know, like you live and breathe in this.
Well, so I'm like, let me give my little part, and then I'm gonna let her just do Tam all over it. One of the things that I appreciated the fact is that, you know, we understand that the critical issues in especially communities of color and in entrepreneurship is lack of access to capital, access to banking, access to, you know, all of that. And so we have a tremendous opportunity with working with our chambers, especially our chambers of color, our African American chamber, our Hispanic chamber, and if you are blessed in cities that have other community groups to have independent chambers, I would boldly dare you to stand up and support them all in this, in education, in finding access for them or assisting them in access. We, in my district, there hadn't been a bank since the 1930s. And it was a priority of mine to put a bank in District 1 in East Waco. And that's happening this year. You know, we didn't have any CDFIs in Waco.
Congratulations.
And we are on the pathway to 2 different CDFIs in Waco. So I think it's imperative that we set the tone and do the work that we can in government in giving access. So period.
Yeah.
I think that you're absolutely spot on. For me, I look at it macro, right? Mm-hmm. You have to have serious investment because there was a concerted effort to disinvest. And yes, and these communities of color. So I go back to, you know, this notion, and I'm clearly passionate about it, because this notion that we can't legislate or undo racism legislation is just ludicrous to me, because you literally legislated racism repeatedly over and over and over and over again. And so that being said, you have to be serious, and you have to have elected officials that are serious about putting investment in these areas, workforce development training. You know, I really try to be very bipartisan in my pulling of questions. And so, and I was looking for people who spoke to Black issues and causes. And so one idea was, you know, same as we have loan forgiveness for certain job sectors, how about a loan forgiveness program for Black college grads, or whatever, however you want it, because we get so touchy to talk about Black people specifically. And so as opposed to other ethnicities, which we all have grievances, absolutely. But I'm speaking about Black people specifically, so I'll refer to that. And then if you really want to let data drive you, that certainly can help this conversation if you're feeling some kind of way about helping Black people specifically. Because you can have loan forgiveness programs for them if they employ 2 or more people once they get out, because a lot of the Black businesses are micro businesses. So they don't get the opportunity to scale up for so many different reasons. When they have credit scores that are the same, when they have expertise that is the same, when they have collateral that are the same, which is hard, I might add, for them to have in the first place. They were literally, and I love to quote the great philosopher Tupac Shakur here.
Come on.
They were a rose growing in concrete. So there's so many different ways, Joseph, and thank you for the question, that you can help have policy play a role. And then right now, one of my biggest concerns are the Fair Credit Act, and how we've seen rollbacks in some of that in implementation. And I think we have to be vigilant and guard those policies that were made to make racial dismantling of racism go away. And we have to really guard them. And the Voters' Rights Act and some of the things that are going on in districts, I mean, that is the way policy can promote entrepreneurship. That being said, I'm gonna get off my soapbox. I see a list of questions. Sarah, are you still helping me?
No, I'm happy to, girls.
No, I'm saying, I'm using my question.
Michelle.
Michelle.
Yeah, Michelle. Yeah, you want to read it, girl? Okay. We can tag in that way. You want to do that? Okay.
Speaking of investments, Michelle said, thinking about when and where structural and interpersonal racism has led to divestment and stagnant inequities like the wealth gap, and thinking about Andrea's brilliant monopoly metaphor, what do you think about the policy recommendations focused on reparations? Not a loaded question at all.
No. I love the 3-4 sentence intro. You know, this is, again, probably will not be a popular immediate response back. Michelle, thanks for the question. But reparations are one of these, you know, it is a political question, or has become very political in the last several years because, you know, I think generally most Americans, most people, and I need to look at polling data, you know, want to believe that we are at a place as a nation, not necessarily post-racial, but that we've come further than Jim Crow, to Tam's kind of comments about racism in legislation over the years. And so when you think about reparations, it's sort of this idea that, you know, the amount of, I've seen stories that, I mean, the staggering amount of it would, you know, reparations would cost. And so then it gets in the political of like, is that the best investment when you have a, you know, mounting debt as a nation and a social security system that's not sustainable? So I think it's something to be considered. I think it could help to, you know, in many places to tighten that wealth gap, to your point, because when you think about generational wealth and, you know, as Andrew was saying, we're not all starting for the same point. Like I remind people, you know, the first generation American and Texan, like the parents who immigrated from one of the poorest countries in the world, like I'm not, you know, I'm not sitting on a nest egg, right? And so what drives me to work and what drives me to think about my future, and if I ever have some progeny, you know, what I'd leave for them or others, has to do with, you know, what wealth do I have or not, or how do I build that? And even if I, you know, decide to bank, you know, say X number of dollars, someone who is my age, who grew up in Highland Park, will still have more money than me. And so I think when you start to think about it that way, it's like, how do you potentially equalize systems or provide more equity in systems to allow people greater opportunity to achieve the American dream? And I think that is the question that we should all discuss at the next hospitality suite. But I also think
is that dangerous?
No, I think it's a very deep question. You know, beyond what I've shared, I think it just, there's a lot to it, because then you think about who's included. Like, would I be included? I mean, my ancestors were slaves, but they were slaves that went back to Africa. So my lineage starts in Africa. Could I get reparations because my parents weren't necessarily slaves that stayed in America post-Reconstruction? I don't know. But these are some of the questions that would then need to be answered when you think about the fairness.
Would be your big concern, right? Andrea?
Implementation, and then overall policy, yeah.
And I do understand that the implementation would be difficult at best, because I don't know that I can put a price on 246 actual years of enslavement or the 401 years where we sit today. I don't know that I could put a dollar amount on, you know, building a country and assisting in the wealth building of a nation who turned its back on me. I don't know that there's a number for that, but I know that there are ways that we could stop oppressive behavior now. And I think there are ways that we could do things to normalize what you understand as the ability to advance and be promoted. So I think that if we get there, then I don't know if we're gonna call that reparations, because I never did exactly, or we never did get that acreage or livestock. So, I'm not sure, and I'm sure that if when we come up with a number, there would find ways and loopholes to get out of that number. So do I believe it? We should have it. Absolutely. Will we get it? It would take a lot.
Radical transformation, right?
Radical transformations. And one of the things that, even as we look to the demands right now for equality and equity, and I mean, those demands that are in the streets, and I was having a candid conversation with folks in my city management office. And I said, as a people, you have to understand, we really do want equity. I mean, separate but equal was the request. you know, and I said, and now if you continue to oppress and you continue to bring physical harm and those things, I said, you need to be glad that as a whole, we're seeking equity.
Not something for our
and not revenge, because it's a little bit too much to take.
That's right. Tam, do you see Laura's question to us in the chat? Laura Dixon, Madam President.
No, I did not.
Okay.
Michelle, to your question about reparations, what does the group think about Robert Smith's 2% pledge? Is this form of private investment a viable reparation solution?
I read that. I think he's on the cover of like Town and Country Philanthropy magazine, which, by the way, the stuff done not only for Morehouse but for in general, just amazing. If you haven't heard about it or read about him, please go look him up after this call. I saw that it was sort of a call to action, if I'm correct about this, in what he's proposing, of like larger companies or institutions trying to divert, like, you know, I guess 2% into Black-owned businesses over the next few years. Is that right, ladies? Is that pretty much his proposal, as a way to sort of equalize or provide more equity in sort of the Black financial structure? And so I can't answer for Michelle, Laura, in the sense that, you know, would this be a good replacement to potentially or good compromise or, you know, option for reparations? But I do think it's that kind of mindset of sort of the larger institutions. It's something we actually just launched this week in Dallas called Dallas Forward, which is where we have, you know, as a way to help with the mayor and a lot of our larger companies, we are promoting that some of the larger Fortune 500s, 100s based here try to help our, you know, small and medium-sized businesses by trying to donate PPE, donations, loans, things like that, to help a lot of those businesses. Because I heard a stat the other night that in Dallas, roughly about 40% of Black businesses are never coming back after this economic downturn. I mean, that's a startling stat for folks as they start to put numbers to what is it that people are talking about when they talk about the devastation. So yes, the Dallas economy will roughly 50%, you know, approximate small and medium-sized businesses. But of that 40% of the Black businesses of that economy are done because of downturn. And so when you start to look at some of those economic figures, I frankly think it makes it harder to not see the differences in the economic opportunity, also in the need to find ways to either be creative with sharing maybe more of the financial prosperity in different parts of the system.
I know that there are a lot of banking institutions and financial institutions that just in response to the reaction of the times and the things that have happened to show their solidarity in equity and building have, you know, pledged millions of dollars to the black community specifically, but the Black and brown communities. But what I challenge them to do, and anyone to do who wants to see investment, is it has to have some sustainability. Because don't just knee-jerk react right now. I don't need your emotion, I need your engagement. And what I need for you to do is create sustainable pathways to wealth generation, and to ensuring that, you know, the holes and pitfalls that have been advanced through time in communities of color are filled and paved and allowed to flourish. I mean, we won't be able to acquire wealth if we don't close some of these holes. And so I think that as large financial institutions go, and whether it's reparations, whether it's whatever, we need to make sure that what we're doing is closing that gap in wealth building.
We have one more question, I think, from Glenn Wood. Glenn, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? You still there?
Yes, sir.
His hand is up. His question, I think he also typed it in to the Q&A. If he doesn't answer, maybe.
Okay. So Glenn's question is, how can we address the minority generational household wealth gap, which was created by governmental policy? Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 619 Project and Robert Johnson, a billionaire, are adamant, as I am, that reparations are essential. What are your thoughts?
I think it's going to take,
before y'all start, I want to, people in the audience may not know that the economic predictions of the median income for wealth for Black people for 2053 are to fall at 0. And I personally think that this should be alarming everyone. And again, it's not just Black people's responsibility to bear. No. And if nothing else, for your own personal self-interest, because it means something for you too.
Absolutely.
So go ahead.
This is the shortest version I can get to this long answer is, this is complete evidence of racial wealth divide. And the only way that because you can't advance wealth from behind. We talked about that already with debt, with loans, with, that educational equalizer, which puts you in debt and you start behind that 3% gap, then becomes 6%. So you'll never catch up nor get ahead. So I think it's going to take, and this is me not being the grand poobah wisdom of tax code, but it's going to take some really interesting tax code changes. I think that, there's got to be some reform in the way we do interest rates on things. And I think that the bottom line of all things is how we do financial education within our community. I think those are the only ways that we're going to normalize that wealth gap.
Yeah, no, I would agree with Andrea. And I think the other part of this, kind of in addition to all the pieces that she laid out, is a bit of role modeling. I think, the other piece of this is people need to see folks in sort of these areas and these roles. Like if you can't see it, sometimes it's really hard to visualize it. And I know that seems very simplistic, but, when you think about where people live in neighborhoods and the roles they play, if a young child doesn't see a Black CEO, then it's not something they can believe. And not that I necessarily voted for Barack Obama, so people don't, come at me. But, I think for many people, seeing his election obviously was influential, even for Black Republicans like myself. I remember talking with my colleagues about what it would mean to have a Black president and how it, in a lot of ways symbolizes progress. And so there is a sense of role modeling in this as well. I know it's not the tangible as far as what can be done to strengthen that wealth gap, but it's got to be a number of tools. But I think, where we are now as a nation, thankfully, is that there's an awareness that there is a gap, right? I mean, for the longest time, it was like people were complaining. You would see the census data every 10 years and look at like the median income of families for a city and then break it down by race, and it was always a big gap. But I think now we've got the attention of our communities and our nation, and I really think and hope we can all work together and understand that, people weren't making stuff up. Like there were really some systematic barriers that prohibited people from, true meritocracy and really living the American dream. And I hope people really take the time to listen and try to figure out then what tools in the policy toolbox can be used to help to provide more equity so that people generationally, their grandchildren, their children will have a better experience than we do.
All right. Well, Andrea, do you, and don't feel compelled, we don't have any more questions in the Q&A, and I just wanted to allow you the opportunity if you wanted to say something more. So
here's the thing. One of the principles that I try to address as we advance the young people, because when I came back here and I realized the distancing between advancement within my community, I said, okay, so, what happened is my mama and my peer group, they said, go be great. And the operative word was go. So we left Waco. And we left a void in Waco because what happened to the layered evidence of excellence, okay? I mean, we went, my mother was a social worker, professor, and then went on into politics. And, while my father was retired military and what blue collar. He ran a printing press for most of his life. There was still evidence of excellence, and there were still, these are the people who advanced and the people who worked. Well, even if you were a blue collar job, you worked at the plant, you were a foreman and you did the things, and there was still a level of pride, there was still a level of advancement, there was dedication to what you did and your professionalism, and that was seen. And so I think what happened is we pulled a whole pocket of folks out of that, and our young community didn't see that anymore. I think that it's imperative that we then make example and continue to be example for our next generation, which is why if I'm doing anything, there's always going to be some kind of educational component for kids. So whatever it is they can learn and they can follow. I mean, my children hate it because I enrolled them in all the classes and all the things, because they, let me give you the opportunity to see and make choices for yourself. That way you can get enough information that people aren't making choices for you. Because people may not make the best choices for you.
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to say before we wrap up, lady, is, on this whole topic of race and policy, I hope what we were able to really, show in our answers today in our dialogue is that, undergirding all public policy in our nation is an element of a racial element, simply because it could be an economic and other policies that are compounded with it. And, if anyone's curious, there is a PBS documentary I recently watched about Clarence Thomas, or one of our Supreme Court justices. And, regardless of what you think, I think people's stories are really fascinating. And the reason he went into law is because he saw his grandfather, who raised him, being pulled over at a very young age by, a white police officer, and then getting, thrown in jail, and finding out that it was, the law or policy that he needed to know better in order to have a better outcome. And so I say, in our society, we live in a great nation, in a great state. Policy really manages all systems. And so I think what hopefully this dialogue today shows that, we got a lot of policies there, but there's just some more equity that we need to ensure that, for generations, we're not having the same conversation over and over.
Well said. And to the fact that, as you address Supreme Court Justice Thomas, without the work of Thurgood Marshall, we would still be with the one. So absolutely. And the advancement of equity and the leadership of strength and fortitude in our community is evidence because of the work of those fine men.
This has been amazing, ladies. And it's been kind of like the Black female version of The View, right? And so all different sectors, all different viewpoints, political affiliations. I'm so thankful for this time with you. And I'm thankful for having an audience and people willing to listen. And I can't wait for us all to be in person again. And thank you, ladies. And if there's nothing else, Laura or Mary Beth, I guess we're done for the day.
Thank you, Tam. I appreciate you, your willingness to facilitate and to moderate this panel.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, Tam, you did a fine job.
You guys have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye, y'all.